I have to shut down all my human rights work. Um, Time's run out. The tumor, my disease, the money. I'm at the end of the line. 77 in September. And I simply have to shut down. Now, I've put everything out on property rights, and what I want to talk about now is Health Canada are killing, and they know they're killing. They are murderers, but they'll never go to jail. And this is my story, but it is the story of millions of people that you'll never hear about. And in particular, it is also now becoming genetic. So what happened to me will happen to your children and your children's children. And it's a pity that I didn't take the $300,000 that I had instead of fighting for human rights and just publish the story with an advertising agency. That would have been a much smarter move, because as it stands, I'm a nobody that nobody's ever heard of. And there will never be any rights and justice in my lifetime. Health Canada is a fascist organization, completely a dictatorship, and the answer to no one. The good news in my story is that you won't find out till the end, but there are ways to control the disease and in particular prevent. But what I want to share with you is what really happens to us. My story happens to be death to dancing, crippled to skiing. I live with dying. But that's not what I want for your children. And it is a true story. Health Canada are murderers, and it's scientifically well known, and it's absolutely true. But you will never see them go to jail for the corruptions and the crimes they have committed. In February 6, 1989, I wrote the full details, including the proof of the science of disease being caused by toxic chemicals in a small town newspaper. An editor helped me at the Walden Observer. It no longer exists. I did not know then the cause of my disease, nor did I ever get a diagnosis in Canada. I did not start out in life either sick or intend to become a victim of such horrendous medical crimes caused by the government of Canada. But this will be what I hope will be there forever, because thanks to Google, it should be out in the universe long after I die. And if I share with you some of my story in the hopes that you may recognize what happened to me is happening to millions, and it can happen to you. Once you are poisoned, what you don't realize is that even if it doesn't seem to affect you at the time, it will pass genetic dysfunction to your children and their children's children. So it can happen to you or someone you love without you even realizing it. People are being systemically poisoned by rapeseed oil. That's R-A-P-E, rapeseed oil, alias canola oil. Toxic chemical additives. It's in our air and our food and our water and our beverages. And we're all victims unaware of the truth. And we are all each suffering in ignorance without knowing that the cause is well known to scientists of the world. But Health Canada's corruption has turned poisoning people into a legal industry. Yes, Health Canada is a fascist dictatorship regime, and they answer to no one. I was born in Verner, Ontario, September 29th, 1941, a beautiful, healthy child. At the age of 6, I was poisoned by sulfuric acid from a local smelter, made worse from that day on by toxic chemicals, air, food, water, and beverages. Because first of all, in Canada, we don't even have the right to know what's in our food and in our beverages. So if it's made in Canada, you don't have the right to know what's in there. Now, despite the painful agony of daily migraines and stomach convulsions making eating very difficult, I loved learning and school. Unlike most children of my generation, I was barred from sports due to unpredictable, crippling attacks, so I spent a great deal of time reading. By the age of 7, I had completed reading everything in the children's library and got permission to take books from the adult library. I had read every history book in their library and had nothing left to read. I distinctively recall that in the adult library, the first book I went to was on psychology. I wanted to understand the insanity of the human species, for it became very clear to me that for some reason, from the history of our species and what I saw in adult behavior in my community, humans just did not make any sense to me. I'm going to give you a little anecdote. And it would have been around 1948. I got the strap for putting my hand up and saying to the nun, Jesus Christ was Jewish. Why are we prejudiced against the Jews? We worship a Jew. Well, make a long story short, when I went home and told my father, it was the one time my father, who is a monstrous, violent maniac and sociopath and a very evil, cruel man, he actually went to bat. He called the bishop in North Bay, and he said if we didn't get a public apology admitting that Jesus Christ was born Jewish, he would launch a lawsuit. Now, my father was a well-educated man, self-taught through reading. He could fight any lawyer in a courtroom with his knowledge. So it was no idle threat. The bishop called the entire Catholic diocese to the Sudbury Arena. I got a public apology, and the bishop admitted that Jesus Christ was born Jewish. So you see, right from grade, what was I think I was in grade 3, I questioned, why were we worshiping a Jew and then turning around and being racist against Jews? That's how my brain thinks logically. It just, nothing ever made any sense to me. From then on, I was kind of a little bit of a hero in the school. Everybody was absolutely amazed that I had accomplished getting an apology and that they had to admit that Jesus Christ was born Jewish. And because I knew my history, I said yes, and that means that he was married at the age of 12 and he followed a Jewish diet. That didn't make the Catholics too happy. I think they're a little more educated now and they'd find some humor in it, but at the time, and I did make a friend of our local priest. He actually admitted to me he thought I was right and that our attitude was wrong. Anyway, for the rest of the school years, I did sing in the choir until the age of 12, and I danced entertaining at family functions despite the painful migraines. By age 8 or 9, I discovered if I did not eat, I could function at a much higher level physically. I loved to be active, swimming, and especially enjoyed winter. Cold made me feel better. I could breathe, and I was always stronger in snow and in winter. I had balance difficulties, so I had a boy across the street, Ronnie, who would skate with me. Cold, snow, and ice reduced the pain. Needless to say, it became routine. Once Mom was asleep, I would put on my snowsuit and go out and roll in the snow. When Father came home from his shift, worked early on, he would find me hiding in the snow, and despite his being such an abusive man, it was the one thing that he did for me as a child. He understood that cold helped the pain and the migraines, and he really wanted me to get an education and go to work. That was his main goal. So he would bribe me to come inside by promising to have ice cream with me. So I have a couple of shared moments with my maniacal father that were really quite pleasant. But for the most point, and the most of my life as a child, it was brutal torture. If he wasn't trying to beat me up, he'd be trying to beat up my brother or my mother. I actually took a butcher knife to him at one point and stopped him. Yes, I was prepared to kill him to stop him from killing my brother and my mother. but my life was really, really agony. I did my homework inside my closet with a flashlight because light caused excruciating pain. And my mother had a bit of a psychotic personality. She chose to ignore my chronic illness and pain. She refused to allow me to have blinds on my bedroom window. And I don't know if anybody knows about migraine, but light can be very blinding, and I'm light sensitive. So it was just excruciating. And she was always trying to force me to eat, which resulted in screaming arguments. Then my father would turn into a rage and try to beat me up, or sometimes he'd defend me and beat her up or attack my brother. It was a constant raging insanity. And my childhood was a nightmare of brutal cruelty, with a few scattered wonderful memories of being rescued by neighbors who would allow me to sleep over with their children and baking cookies that did not make me sick. Looking back at the French family across the street and the Ukrainian family, Mrs. Marshall was old-fashioned, and she used lard or butter and no newfangled margarine for her, so therefore her food wasn't as toxic as ours. My mother was working, and we were on fast foods a lot. But of course, that's hindsight. I didn't know that at the time. And Mrs. Oystrik, Ronnie's mom, he was my hero in my childhood, was Ukrainian, and her cooking also did not make me sick. Nor did my great-grandmothers or French grandmothers. My father's mother lived with us, and sometimes her cooking did not make me sick, and sometimes it did. Well, that's because of all the fast foods that we had in the home. My mother's especially always made me sick. She worked full-time and had no time to cook the old-fashioned way, which no doubt had a lot to do with why I was always so sick. My father was a junk food addict, and that surely did me a great deal of harm, as well as being the victim of a sulfuric acid fallout from the giant Inco, now Vale, smokestack and abundance of fast foods. I took my first paralyzing attack when I was 6 years old. And I continued to take crippling attacks. But despite my severe disability, hiding the pain, I was trained as a model. So I'd learned to camouflage how I was feeling. I became a very good actress, working twice as hard as everybody else, and became a very successful career woman. I will purposely omit my teen years modeling secretary assistance to a wonderful man, our Sudbury, Ontario Mayor, Joe Fabreau, who rescued me from the violence and the rapes and the abuse by telling me to leave Sudbury and go to Toronto, where I would be appreciated for my brilliant analytical brain. He encouraged me to go into the world of real estate investments, and I did move to Toronto. But between the date rape and the joy of, I wound up being date raped, and then I got pregnant. Truthfully, while I was pregnant, my immune system changed, and actually I was very well for those 9 months. I have a lovely memory of John Wayne stopping his parade to come over and chat with me in my condition 9 months pregnant. I dearly adored and loved my son, but with my disease, the violence of my father, and the kind of man that his father was, no, I couldn't bear to have him raised in that environment. So I gave him up at the 8 months old. I gave him up for adoption with a true mother's love. I was too sick to take care of him and did not want him anywhere near my abusive family or his father who had no morals. It was 2 years before I was well enough to work full time. And the one thing that George, the father of my child, did, he was a married man, but he did financially take care of my bills during that period. And eventually he found me a doctor who discovered that the doctor of my pregnancy, who happened to be a woman, left the afterbirth inside of me, which was poisoning me. After a D&C cleanout, I had a very quick, remarkable recovery, and I had a couple of good years. I had excellent typing and shorthand skills, so jobs came easy to me. And I looked good. And I had this analytical brain, don't forget, and hypnogenetic imagery analysis, and a photogenic memory. So that really got me into a lot of careers. I was in the stock market in 1963. They wanted me to become the first woman stockbroker. I turned it down. I was afraid of becoming that committed in a career. They offered me $55,000 a year, and I still turned it down. I was afraid of money, to tell you the truth. My father worshipped money to such a point that it gave me a kind of sick attitude about money. Of course, looking back, that was part of my dysfunction emotionally. It's a pity. If I'd had the right kind of teachers around me, my life might have been very different. In 1964, I took another major attack and I couldn't work. But I had enough money in the bank to see me through a few months. And a dear friend to cheer me up took me to meet Elizabeth Taylor. That was an incredible experience. When she took my hand, something just vibrated through me. She had the most amazing chemistry. Soft, compassionate, beautiful. And I don't mean physically, which of course she was. She felt immediately my pain. She had such empathy and offered to help me. But I believed the lies my doctor told me, that it was genetic and there was no help. And I told her, thank you, but there is nothing anybody could do. But at the time, I did suggested that if they wanted to have a safe haven to buy a property in Rosedale, and Richard Burton got a kick out of my real estate knowledge. So we talked a bit about that, which in fact eventually they did do. But it was really not the only time I was offered help and turned it down because I had been lied to by the doctors. And the doctors were, of course, being lied to by their own education and Health Canada. So it's a vicious cycle. Today, it's true that people are being born like me because their parents are poisoned and they pass it on to their children. But my mother wasn't poisoned, and neither was my father. And I was not born with the disease. I acquired it at the age of 7. There is a difference. But it's very likely that I passed the dysfunction to my son. Although I never heard from him, so I have to assume that either he had a really great life and wasn't interested, or he was healthy and wasn't interested. But nevertheless, my attacks would suddenly come without warning, and then suddenly I would recover. Never escaped the painful migraines, but I did escape periodically crippling attacks. So I was never truly out of work for 23 years in Toronto. In 1966, I did paralyze for 2 months. They did research on me at the Mount Sinai Hospital, but they found nothing wrong. Well, of course, how could they find something wrong? I have a disease that Health Canada doesn't recognize that chemical poisoning is causing disease. So how can you have a test for a condition when the medical field doesn't admit that it even exists? If they did, industry would be forced to put control on their products. They would have to have controls in the cars, trucks, and machines that poison the air. You'd have to recycle. You wouldn't be allowed to put anything into the atmosphere. Global warming, well, you put an end to that, tootswit. Food industry would have to stop using toxic pesticides and adding toxic chemical additives to our food. And canola oil, rapeseed oil would be banned, as it was banned in the United States until 1994. Oh yes, the glory of hindsight, but I was not privy to any of that information at the time. I would be struck by paralyzing attacks that struck like lightning, electrocuting, excruciating, mind-boggling pain, memory loss, blackouts for days or months, profuse bleeding and infections spread through my body like a prairie fire. Green pus would ooze out of my belly button. My life was beyond my ability to control. I spent the next 20 years of my life picking up the fragmented pieces of myself, splattered amongst the tattered remnants of a career in shambles, amid the rubble of financial chaos, in a gruesome battle for survival with no medical treatment or even a true diagnosis of my disease. My life was a diabolical, brutal nightmare. And I was abused, and I was raped. Of course. All you had to do was feed me 1 ounce of alcohol, and next thing I'd know, I'd wake up in Vancouver. I continuously struggled for success only to be robbed of life's pleasures by another catastrophic attack, and never knew why. I woke up once in Vancouver with a lesbian biker gang taking very good care of me, feeding me homemade chicken soup. They, and with the help of an unemployed pimp, he had no hooker at the time, carried me in and out of the Vancouver hospital too many times to count. I tried working as a bunny girl, but frankly, the pay was lousy, the men rude, and I hated Vancouver. Specialists were called in and they suggested that the Vancouver low pressure, high humidity may be killing me and that I couldn't breathe and I needed to return to Toronto. I woke up one time in the Satan's Choice coffee house who fed me coffee. Then I was lucky. The man in charge took pity on me and told me that I could have been taken hostage and shipped to Arabia as a sex slave, warning me that I should not wander the streets by myself. Of course, I would sometimes be raped while catatonic, but that was usually some business pervert, never by people from the streets. No, it was from my boyfriends or the people that I trusted. Rarely from a stranger. There were men friends who also did take care of me and rescue me. Hundreds and hundreds of times, too many times to count. Someone one day put marijuana in my muffins and I was catatonic for 3 days. They were terrified they'd kill me. And they were so afraid to admit it because it's illegal that they just kept detoxifying me and they put me to bed with their 3 children and feeding me some kind of Jamaican broth. I think his grandmother was Jamaican and she came up with this broth. Anyway, I survived. They told me that the children stayed in bed with me for 3 days and prayed for me. Yes, children's hearts are amazing. Many a child has rescued me over the years. I went finally in 1980 into real estate and was highly successful, making the national leaders with Royal Trust, mainly due to my business partner. He was a mortgage broker of 23 years, and he was a developer. So, I'd get 28 houses of his listings at a time, and I gave him half my profits. Because I was never really big on making money. I was always fighting for human rights in one form or another, and rights for women and rights for children. I remember in 1975 I marched up Yonge Street for rights to the common law's wife to the matrimonial home. I thought we had won. I didn't know. This is 2018, and they still don't have any rights. But I didn't know that. I never realized to the extent. Americans kept telling me that Canada wasn't a democracy, and it isn't that I didn't believe them. It's just I didn't understand what they were talking about. Shortly after, in 1983, I was 5 months catatonic. I had Royal Trust disability insurance, but my doctors absolutely refused to do anything about it. And then just one day I was unable to work. I loved working with rich or poor, especially enjoyed helping the working class buy a property that was not just a home but a good investment. I could have worked with millionaires, they were always begging me, but I was never that interested in either being famous or wealthy. I just got more enjoyment of helping the little people get ahead. I had purchased 3 properties and felt assured of my financial safety and my future. I could never have imagined that one day I would take an attack that would rob me of my brain, my memory, and it would just never return. And nothing I did would reverse the crippling, paralyzing attack. Seventh-day Adventists had been helping me stay alive for decades, but somehow by 1983 it stopped working. I was taken hostage by a beast for 5 months, forced alcohol into me repeatedly in blackouts, and anally raped. It would be many years before I discovered that what he had done to me, and there were witnesses who knew and pretended nothing was wrong. I remember a taxi driver taking me to the Mount Sinai Hospital, and I was bleeding from both ends. And she gave me a dirty look. It was a female doctor. Yeah, and I got to tell you, a lot of the women doctors were more abusive to me than the men, although they were pretty bad too. Anyway, she threw me out. And that wasn't the only time. It happened more than once. She assumed I was having sex by choice. She assumed. I didn't even know I had been anally raped. I was in a blackout. It would be years before those memories would come back to haunt me, and that haunt me to this day. Even my mother supported this beach, urging me to stay with him since I could no longer support myself. But then my mother often did that. In fact, she always did that, from the first rape to the last one. Yes, my mother was psychotic. I took care of her more than she ever took care of me. My mother was my child. As for my insurance, well, Dr. Keltz and Dr. Galley, 23 years, they all abandoned me and left me to die in agony in the streets, refusing to sign it. I was desperately afraid to lose my property, so I sold one property to buy freedom from the beast, James Kelly. I hope the bastard's dead. He was so evil. That man was so evil. When I tried to report it to the police, they wouldn't charge him. They wouldn't even investigate. Then I lost a property because I couldn't keep up the mortgage payments. The other one I had tenants, and I was able, with my disability, I could have kept it. But when the doctors refused to sign my disability, I decided to go with another broker. He was just another man taking advantage of me, thinking that I could still make him money like I had been doing. I had been so good at it. And he talked me into quitting Royal Trust and going with the agency. Needless to say, I could not function well enough to make him rich, and so then he abandoned me, and I was left in abject poverty. And that's how I lost the last of my house, my home. Needless to say, drowning in despair, lost my home, all my investments, the brutality of both my disease and the society in which I lived, I tried to kill myself. I drove to Scarborough Bluffs, determined to drive off the cliff. 3 feet from the edge, the car stopped as if by the hand of some unseen being. I was speeding at about 50 miles per hour behind a monastery, and it just came to a sudden stop 3 feet from the edge. I got out of the car, sobbing, gazing in confusion at the blood-red sky, and in a fury began screaming at God to let me die. At that point, a ball of light literally wrapped me and picked me up and gently put me in the back seat of my car and wrapped me in a pink cloud of sleep. When I woke the next day, I was still determined to die. I turned the key and the car started. I shut it off to check the beach below, making sure it would kill me. When I got to the edge, I heard children laughing, giggling with glee. I sat down at the edge of that cliff, staring down at them playing in the sand and water. And then a vision at that moment became clear. I had no choice. I had to live for them. For one day those children may be or have children like me. I made the decision to survive and to seize my research somehow. I knew not how. I just knew for the sake of the future generations of children, I had to try. The fact that I could no longer read, write, or speak beyond the level of 5-year-old child proved to be a hindrance in my quest, of course. Once I left Toronto, having lost my home on the streets in abject poverty, I still had a a cabin on my parents' lot in Wasaga Beach. Once I got into the clean air of Wasaga Beach, although I couldn't read except with great difficulty, I could drive and I could type. My brain dysfunction affected everything but that. Speaking, communication was painfully difficult, yet I was able to make myself understood. I was still able to research. That gift in my brain was still there. Even though I didn't even understand what I was reading, I would read it, and then I'd get a picture in my head that would be like looking at a vision or a movie screen, and it would give me the name, and it would compute and analyze the information, and it gave me the name of cheminosis, a disease caused by toxic chemicals that came up in scientific journals recorded by the Royal Society of Scientists in London, 1775. A biochemist and owner of the Wasaga Beach Shoppers Drug Store offered to teach me to understand the world of microscopic bugs. I went on a strictly organic diet, and frankly, despite the painful migraines, chronic fatigues, and inability to write coherent sentences, I was not doing so bad in that little cabin. Unfortunately, my mother insisted I return back to Sudbury and to my father, and after a few months he threw me out into the snow in a blizzard. A man in AA, Les Crow, came to my rescue. 1985, I took several more attacks. He rushed me to hospital, and I have a vivid memory of a young, handsome Dr. Bodra giving me Benadryl, but he said it was not a cure. All it did is it stopped me from dying. And he put it on my chart that it should not be used as a remedy. He said I was chemically hypersensitive and drugs could have an adverse effect on someone like me. I remember asking him how come he knew that. And he said he read a lot of American medical journals. He planted that seed into my brain that I had to research with Americans. But before I had that opportunity, fate took another grotesque turn in my life. I was put on basic welfare, but the social worker demanded I become the patient of Dr. Brian Lynch. He was a psychotic, sociopathic maniac, and he deliberately went against Dr. Bodra's instructions, and he forced me to use daily Benadryl, which put me into a toxic shock syndrome. And then he had my mother take me and incarcerate me illegally into the Sudbury and General Mental Ward to kill me, to make sure I died. He removed my distilled bottled water from me. He was so stupid, he actually thought this was a democracy and he would go to prison if it was found out what he did. When I tried to tell the police what he did, he said there's nothing he could do. He said, you have to just live. So I escaped the clutches of those bitches and him from the help of an old client in Toronto. She had a vision that my mother was somehow involved in doing me harm. Yes, she had followed Dr. Lynch's instructions, and she took me there at the hospital and then abandoned me with no one to protect me. But Elizabeth called everywhere and found me at the hospital and demanded to talk to me. She could be very assertive, so they gave me the phone. She said she knew what happened. She called Barbara from the CBC wanting her to do my story. But Barbara said she did one on a woman like me in Barrie, Ontario, and her ratings went down. But she said if I died, I'd do a story. Oh, I cursed that woman for a long time. Silently. But then I played a role. I pretended that Barbara Frum was going to do a story on me if I was not released immediately, and that all those nurses would wind up in court, and it was illegal to keep me here. So as I hung up the phone, I said, I'll be leaving shortly, and I turned to the nurses. And I said, now, you heard. You want to be on television? You release me right now. Needless to say, I was released darn quick. I called Tom Murphy, my dearest friend and my guardian angel, and he picked me up and he drove me to friends in Brantford. He took a leave of absence to take care of me for a few months. He was a miner. When we got to Brantford, They were very religious people that worked in a hospital in Kitchener, whom I'd known for decades and loved and trusted. Yet despite the fact that I couldn't walk, could only shuffle in agonizing pain, couldn't write, and could barely speak, instead of trying to get me medical help, he decides he's going to get me a job at the hospital and put me back to work. Tom had already left when I realized this was a huge mistake. They put me to bed in their attic with children whom I dearly loved. I had to crawl on my hands and knees up the stairs. I lay on the bed and I looked up at the ceiling. It was a ripped out ceiling. Oh my God, the insulation was hanging loose, mold on the roof. I did not know much at this point, but I knew that I was going to die here if I stayed here. I began to weep, wanting to die, when another vision came towards me, slowly saying, "Trudi, get up. I love you. Get up. You cannot die. You have work to do. You must save these children." And I recognized him. "Bob, is that you? Bob?" "Yes, it's me," he said. The next hour was like an eternity. Bob Temple was my fiancé that had been killed by a drunk driver October 29th, 1960. That afternoon he had told me that we would not be able to be married because he would die soon. And he explained I had to research my disease, that 200 years from now, millions of children will be saved by my research, as they will all be born just like me. The truth is, I was so traumatized by his death, I never remembered much of what he told me. And as he hovered above me in that attic, I felt like I had to be dreaming, yet I knew it was real. And I begged him to help me. It was so painful for me to move and to get out of bed. But he explained that he did not have the power to pick me up or carry me, but that he would stay with me and he would do what he could, and he was going to lead me to someone who would help me survive. He made it very clear I was dying, but I was not meant to die. I had to do this research into my disease. Getting dressed and out the door in the clean, cold, wintry wind was lovely. The image of Bob and his loving whispers of encouragement got me to about 3 blocks away to a Tim Hortons coffee shop. Once I got to the door, I could not open it. He said, "Yell for help. I don't have the physical power. Yell for help. I have to leave you here now, but remember, you wait. Someone is coming to help you. You wait no matter how long. Don't leave." And I don't know how long I was in there, except to say that I asked for coffee, and I was trying to wean off the Benadryl because I was addicted to it by now, of course. And suddenly, a very tall policeman came in and asked, "Is there someone here that is sick and needs help?" Now, by this time, there were taxi drivers and truck drivers, and I'd all told them my story, and they all stayed. They wanted to see who was going to come to rescue me. I had had a vision from a dead man. They were fascinated, of course, and they wanted to see, was somebody really going to come to rescue me? So they all said, "Yeah, there she is," pointing to me. I guess I was on my 6th cup of coffee. God knows how many I'd had. Coffee was the one thing since the age of 6 that got me to my feet. It triggers adrenaline, of course, and that's why. But I didn't know that at the time. We talked for a long time. He shared with me his dead brother had died due to medical neglect. He had abandoned his brother, as my mother and family had abandoned me. But after he died, he regretted it, and he began to do some research, and he discovered chemical hypersensitivities was rampant and growing in leaps and bounds in each generation because we are being systemically poisoned. He explained how I could wean off Benadryl safely, but he had no cure, only that American agencies had all kinds of science that Health Canada was ignoring. "They're murderers," I said. "Yes," he said, "they are. They are murderers." He said, "They murdered my brother." And he said, "It was my dead brother that told me how to get to you, Trudi." Yes, his dead brother came to him in a similar vision as mine. He was on duty driving his car in Mississauga when his brother came to him in front of his windshield and told him to follow him. He had to save the life of someone like him. Now, what happened from that day on is well documented on my websites. And I've also done a more detailed, graphic, restricted story on a free website. And because it's free, I'm hoping it will outlive me. Because my other two websites I pay for, and when I die, they die. And all that work and all that research dies with me. So the bottom line is, do you know or have you ever heard of anyone suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic viruses, candidiasis, addictions, chronic flu, asthma, allergies, food and drug and alcoholism, cerebral brain damage, hyperactivity, Alzheimer's, bleeding disorders, violent mood swings, erratic behavior, gastritis, cardiovascular diseases, migraines, cancer, dementia, memory loss, learning disabilities, autism, schizophrenic-like episodes, muscular dysfunction, sudden crippling or paralyzing attacks, irrational phobia or paranoia, immune deficiencies, chemical hypersensitivities. These are just a few of the symptoms of cheminosis, that is, any disease caused by being chemically poisoned. Now, toxic shock syndrome eventually leads to death by cardiac arrest or by mysterious infections that rapidly spread, causing death, and often misdiagnosed. Most are never treated for the cause of being poisoned. I would be 70 years old before I discovered that rapeseed oil, alias canola oil, hidden in Canadian food, not identified on the label, was one of the main causes of my disease, and that we've no right to know what's in our food in Canada. In 1989, I flew to New York, and there a kind neurologist gave me a name, Parkinsonism, so that I could fight our medical associations in Canada and get legal recognition of a disease caused by chemicals. He said to me, cheminosis is too ancient a terminology for doctors to accept, but Parkinsonism will be much more acceptable to their egotistical arrogance. That was in May of 1989. Today is August 25th, 2018, and nothing has changed but me. All the proof I ever needed was well known. Health Canada has continued to refuse to allow Canadians the right to know what is in our food, and no law is required to have companies to list all ingredients on all food labels in Canada. At the age of 70, I boycotted Canadian food. And I had been on okra since 1995, which also came to me in a vision. Now, what okra did was it gave me back the ability to relearn and gave me back my memory. It does not cure the disease. And it took me 22 years to be able to write to the level that I am at today. But still, not good enough to ever be published, and not famous enough or worthwhile enough to ever be published. Loblaws has refused to ever give me a list of ingredients because our laws do not require them to do it. Metro in Canada, however, head office in Montreal, is not so blatantly callous, and they always try to give me a list, even though the law does not require a label of full disclosure. You have to phone them long distance, their 800 number, and they will do what they can to help you, but not Loblaws. And I've been poisoned on Loblaws products too many times to count. I found chicken feathers in their organic salad. There was cod oil, which I'm allergic to, in their so-called vitamin A. And when I asked them for a product that didn't have cod in it, they gave me this product, and I took an attack and I nearly died. And each time I have to use my okra detox system, which is on my website, to pull myself out of the attack. I have to purge, and I have to reverse the brain damage. And then I have to go on garlic pills to pump up my immune system. And I live with dying. I go from death to dying, paralyzed to crippling on a daily basis. What's really interesting, though, is if Loblaws and Metro ship to the United States, they have to print everything on the label. They just don't bother to do it for Canadians because the law doesn't require it to. Metro was going to, but because Loblaws refused to do it, they couldn't take on the cost all by themselves. So GMO is not a product I'm going to get into, but of course it is an extremely dangerous practice because they are genetically splicing pesticides into our wheat and our grains that are causing my disease. They are putting codfish into a genetic modified fish, and you don't know if you have an allergy, then you don't got no way of knowing and choosing what you're eating. But it is extremely dangerous. And the fact that we don't know what is GMO and what isn't, the only way is to go organic and buy non-GMO products. Put your money where your mouth is. Yes, Health Canada are murderers, and Canadian children with allergies or chemical hypersensitivities are suffering and dying in Canada with less rights than a stray dog. Not one person at Health Canada will ever be held accountable for the crimes and the millions they will kill or go to jail. Rapeseed, alias canola oil, was scientifically known to have caused the symptoms of my disease, which is why it was banned in the United States and Europe until 1994. Health Canada's fascist corruption falsified scientific reports to get the FDA ban lifted, and it has since spread throughout the world unhindered. The patent was held by Monsanto, and Monsanto has since been purchased by Bayer, and Bayer will be purchased by God knows who. So you'll never find out the truth, and they will never be held accountable for their crimes. My life has been one of going from death to dancing and crippled to cross-country skiing, in and out of attacks. I am not cured. I can never be cured. And 4 years ago, I got a tumor, a parasitical fat cell tumor, feeding off a main artery so it cannot be operated on, and it did severe nerve damage. And I'm no longer able to pull out completely and control the Parkinsonism that I was able to for 2 years. I was beautifully well at the age of 70. 71, 72, I was better than well. I was gorgeous. At 73, the tumor took me down. And it set me back 30 years, and I had to start all over again. I could barely read or write. And that's where I was vulnerable to fraud and the lies of a lawyer, Trent Faldine. May he burn in hell for what he did to me. Well, not much more I can say. I'm not cured. I can never be cured. I live with dying one day at a time. But my disease, Parkinsonism, cheminosis, can be prevented. But failing that, although not easily, it can be controlled. My Ochre for Life diet is not a quick fix. It takes a great deal of effort in discovering for yourself what foods are your personal enemy. And there are American agencies that have that information. I've sent it to them. How to bring your brain and body to its full potential despite adversity. You must have a couple of raw okra every day, and that will prevent your brain from going into the kind of dysfunction that mine and the brain damage that I have. It will help to control it, and it will help to rejuvenate. God willing, I have done my job, and the rest is up to you. I know this that more and more children are now being born like me. When I was born in 1941, I don't think more than 1% of the population were like me. Today it's about 30%. That's how far we have advanced in dysfunction and disease due to being poisoned. So yes, the rest is up to you. I've done all I can. God willing, someone out there will put a stop to this. Over and out. One day at a time. Thank you.